discovered consistently and persistently is that at the height of laissez-faire, you also had an extremely strong tradition of voluntary redistribution from those who had wealth to those who needed it. And this was not regarded, generally speaking, as simply a kind of naked preference of the sort like I prefer strawberry to pistachio ice cream. It was regarded as a moral obligation or an imperfect legal obligation enforced by social sanction and supported by conscience. So it wasn't thought to be one of these simple optional things. And I think the reason why the redistribution question turns out to be as difficult as it is that people accept this particular framework, they're then going to ask the question, if we can do this voluntarily and we understand why it's going to be done, ought we to do it politically to the event that we think that the amount of voluntary transfers are going to be insufficient in order to carry the day and get us to the point where we would like to be. So the next question that you have to ask is, can we take a moral intuition and transfer it into a set of legal obligations? And this, I think, is where the problems start to begin. But I'm going to treat them as problems rather than as knockout blows. I want to express what the difficulties are and how I think you ought to organize this. And so I will come up with what I regard as a far-sighted and progressive program, which I sometimes put under the label of redistribution last. And what I mean by that is that the first task in trying to create a social order is to handle the problem of poverty through production and the increase in wealth. Once you do that, there may well be those who are laggards, but if you can increase the size of the pie, you can increase the probabilities that voluntary contributions will solve the issue, or if they will not, if you can increase the size of the pie, you'll put less strain on the system when it comes to the question of how you do redistribution. So what are the problems with respect to redistribution? Which means that you can't take it off the table, you sort of have to put it at the back of the table. I think the first one that you always have to ask is, what's the optimal level of redistribution that you want to deal with, and what's the metric that you're going to use to solve it? When people are in favor of a progressive taxation, there's always one lacunae in the argument that needs to be filled. How steep ought the progressivity to be? I'm a great defender of this flat tax, but I won't even talk about that here. Steve will do this. But if you're trying to think about progressivity, if it's a slight progression, it doesn't get you much. If it's a steep progression, it may result in real administrative difficulties on the one hand, and a general growing of incentives on the other. To put the thing even further, the moment you let the tilt of the statute go into play, there are going to be vast political forces trying to increase it or reduce it. And you run the danger that the dissipation of wealth in order to create the tax structure that you like will, in fact, negate most of the gains that you're going to produce from it. And you also have, of course, the incentive effects that take place. If redistribution does take place, there'll be less incentives produced by those who are going to be forced to make the redistribution, and less incentives to produce by those who are going to get it, each side preferring to devote their resources to conflicts between the parties instead of trying to move things up. These are unbalanced things that we would rather avoid. And the general view that I have is there's a certain level of which is a strong social consensus that supports the modest redistribution. Once you go beyond that, it's going to become much more difficult to figure out the way in which you want to operate the overall system. And then the second thing you have to worry about, this is the technical matter, is exactly how you measure the base for which the redistribution is going to take place. One of the common statements, for example, by the president is that people are defined as rich if they earn $250,000 a year. Well, that may be rich in Manhattan, Kansas, as I like to say, doesn't get you very far if you're in New York City. In addition to that, when you start looking at wealth, it's a very bad measure of what it is that somebody has, I mean income, because of all the difficulties with the permanent income hypothesis. So there are many young doctors and lawyers and professionals who earn $250,000 but have twice that amount of accumulated debts, because what they did is they deferred their income earlier on and are going to pay it back with their future earnings. If you start using redistribution off of snapshots, you miss all of those kinds of variances, and that's going to mean that the tax is going to hit those people who ought not to take place. Trying to run income averaging against this stuff is not going to deal with the problem of indebtedness. You've got a lot of technical issues on this thing, which should, I think, slow you down. Now, the second point that I want to make about this time takes the thing one step further, which is how do you know you're going to do the only kind of redistribution which makes sense, which is to take advantage of diminishing marginal utility of wealth and to create a system in which you transfer from those who have to those who not. And what I'm referring to here more generically is the entire system of public choice difficulty, where in fact redistribution often goes in the wrong direction for the wrong reasons through the wrong time of programs. One of the reasons why I've been such a strong defender of college in Kansas, and in fact of the classical liberal course, is that I think whenever you look at a whole variety of social programs which are ostensibly adopted for other reasons, it turns out that many of them have very profound and very bad kind of redistributive tendencies that one ought to be able to deal with. So, for example, whenever you start dealing with a monopoly-type situation from a competitive industry, there is a huge transfer of wealth which takes place from the consumers and goes to the producers. There is a reduction in consumer surplus, and there is an overall reduction in social losses by the creation of deadweight loss. This is the standard diagram of monopoly in Economics 101 course. And the thing about it that is true is it's one, simple, and two, correct. So you start looking at programs which are engaged in redistribution. Oftentimes they are A, wealth disruptive, and B, they're transferring the wealth to the wrong people. So I lived some part of the time in New York City, and you start looking at the way in which a rent control law works in that particular place. And it turns out there's a huge transfer of wealth that takes place, and it often goes to people of great privilege whom you cannot pry out of their apartments on Central Park South, even though they're paying the landlord only $2,500 a month to live with them. And if you don't like that particular example, we can continue to multiply them. The second one that I always like to think of is the whole program of agricultural subsidies in the United States, which can only be treated as a profound and horrible mistake. And what is it? These are programs of income redistribution, which are designed to protect farmers against the world's price markets. And when you start to do that, what happens is people remain in the business too long. They become politically entrenched. And what they do is they raise prices up to the point where it causes genuine inconvenience. There have been a number of studies about the way in which these price control systems work in the 1930s when the Roosevelt administration announced that the only reason we have cartels is that the people in the industry know exactly the way in which to allocate their goods. And for every single increase in price that you get through these cartels, it turned out you had a decline in the standard of living in the urban poor. If you want to try this on with respect to the minimum wage, there's massive redistribution going on in that particular case. And it's not only from workers to employers. A lot of it is from those workers who can't meet the minimum wage standard and so therefore are knocked out of jobs in favor of those people who are above the standard in question. So if you just look at the recent ill-considered increases in the minimum wage that have taken place over the last 3 years or so, the net effect that one regrettably sees about this is a very high rate of increase in the amount of teenage unemployment, particularly among members of minority groups. So what's the particular concern that you have here? Is quite simply this. You start running these kinds of redistribution programs, you then end up in the sort of Yale universe of Jed Rubenfeld, which you don't know what property rights are, or you can't figure out what redistribution is, and that opens the way for all sorts of horrific things that you never defend on principle, and the only way in which you can oppose them, in my judgment, is to start to put together a kind of a coherent program which goes on exactly the opposite direction. You don't want to start with an illustration of how the government doles out things. You want to ask the question of how it is that the government got those things to dole them out in the first place. And once you understand that those things are coming from tax revenues from ordinary people, all of a sudden the level of constraints that you want to put on what it is that the state can do with them is vastly different. So essentially, when you start looking at this whole problem, I'm just going to summarize it in one sentence now, is that the difficulty that you have with respect to redistribution quite simply is that the moral case for some is quite compelling, but the level of erosion that the principle has when you try to do it through legal enforcement turns out to be enormously great for a variety of technical and political problems. Smart people, when they realize how difficult this thing is, don't want to make it the centerpiece of their program. They want to see the rest of the house in order and only then turn to redistribution. So I will end on this note. Redistribution last is the way in which I think you ought to organize the social order. Thank you.